Good day, and welcome to the 8th lecture in Theology and Humor, a study of church history and how satire and humor and laughter have kind of intersected with religious concerns. We leave the early church and we move into the Dark Ages. And in the Dark Ages, this medieval time, we find that there is more mirth than you probably would have expected. There is a lot of pleasure even as we get into the Inquisition. I mean, we look at the devil himself and he says, I need someone well-versed in the art of torture. Do you know PowerPoint? And for some of you, it may have seemed like that, but don't worry, the Inquisition will pass. But the next thing we see is that we have this amnesia about this time. We don't understand the Middle Ages as much as we need to, and to see what it contributes to us today. Stephen Wright, one of my kind of favorite comedians, very deadpan and ironic, said, right now I'm having amnesia and deja vu at the same time. I think I've forgotten this before. So we may forget certain things from the Middle Ages, but we are going to remember them and go over them today. Now, the first thing we look at that is next is the one document that really establishes the whole cosmology, the understanding of the structure of the Middle Ages, this great edifice, is Dante's The Divine Comedy. And notice it's called The Divine Comedy. It is a comedy because it ends well, and it creates these three spheres. It looks at the laughter in heaven. In fact, when Dante actually goes to heaven, the first thing he hears is this celestial laughter. But then we have the weeping in hell, and also this kind of pain that you get in purgatory, the mountain of purgatory, the 7-story hill that we see in the background. But along the way, Dante also includes quite a bit of wit and satire. For example, in the Inferno, he prepares Pope Boniface, who is not yet dead, but is one of his enemies from Florence. He puts him in the 8th circle of hell for his simony, for selling church offices, to trying to make money. And he is buried head first in this pit with his feet sticking up on fire. And what a wonderful image for some of our religious leaders to end up this way after having preached so much hell and brimstone to us. Now, the next thing we see is that he also puts down those people who are a little too solemn and melancholy. He says, because certain people remain so doggedly sad and melancholic in the presence of God's sweet air and sunshine, when he gives us so much gladness on this earth, these sullen people are consigned to the darkest region where they can nurse all of their grievances. And so we get this picture that laughter is coming into this era, and it is not only sneaking in. Now, first we go back next and we look at the influence of some of the ascetic church fathers. These are people who wanted to discipline their flesh. They were very stoic in many ways. And so monks felt very called to focus upon the suffering and the death of Jesus. This is why many times we see the crucifix instead of the empty cross. They were called to renounce the world, the flesh, and the devil, as are we, but that also included laughter and included an appreciation of God's gifts. But if we sneak next, we can find that there is a secret life of these ascetic monks. They had a tendency to kind of look at illuminated manuscripts, eat potato chips, and laugh. And we're going to see next how they began to laugh. John Huizinga wrote a book on Homo Ludens, which is man the player, the man, the person who loves to play. And it's a kind of a study of how play has existed throughout culture. We find that holy days are going to become holidays. And so the holiday is still a holy day. It is a time not only of recreation, but a time of being recreated. We are recreated in the grace and the joy of our Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, during this time, we find a virtue of hilaritas, and we've seen that virtue before, of cheerfulness, of laughter. It's used as a theological strategy for converting people through risibilitas. Priests began to kind of collect what were known as Joco Sanctorum, holy jokes. Joco, joke, Sanctorum, holy. And these are short, witty stories that they would tell from the pulpit. We find especially on Easter, they would tell this kind of holy story of how God overcame Satan. In fact, one of the great reformers in the 10th century was Odo of Cluny. And Cluny was a great place in France where they reformed and they brought the Benedictine rule in, but they enjoyed what they did. And he was so powerful as a preacher. They said that he made his companions laugh until they cried and were unable to speak to one another. This was a wonderful time that began. Now, next, however, we find that there are these Goliards, these kind of students. They're basically sophomores, and sophomore, of course, means soft, meaning wisdom, and more, meaning moron. They're wise fools. They're really not too bright. They're students who are basically your C students who are barely going to make it through the university. But they began to pick up music. They began to write songs. They began to write poetry. And they move from one place to the next. In fact, this next place we find that their leader allegedly was Bishop Goliath. He was a leader not only of the students, but of monks and drunks. And we really don't know the origin of the word Goliards. It may have come from the Latin gula, meaning gluttony, because they ate so much and drank so much, or this idea of the Bishop Goliath, which is a form of the term Goliath. And we know Goliath is so large, and so it expresses their kind of talent for heavy drinking, large drinking. And yet it really brought these students out who lampooned not only the church leaders, but also the political establishment and other people like university professors. Now, the next thing we see is that they really did like to drink a lot and make merry. These are like the kind of the frat boys you find at the University of Virginia or Virginia Tech. They are boys who are enjoying themselves a little too much. But next we find that they also wrote and composed and sang naughty songs. They taught people how to kind of put their emotions into music. In fact, the next thing is their vagabond songs. In their vagabond songs, they would kind of wander around, these minstrels, and they would talk quite a bit about the Wheel of Fortune. The Wheel of Fortune was this medieval trope that talked about the fate of everyone. And someone who was a king one day may fall and fall miserably and become impoverished by the end. And some poor person, a pauper, could become a prince. And so you have this wonderful cycle and circle where judgment would come upon people. And it was a foolish, hilarious judgment that people deserve. Today we have a children's song, the wheels of the bus go up and down, up and down. And back then we would find that the fate of people would go up and down. And so they would mock the establishment with a lot of these things. And next we find that a lot of these songs came from a kind of the Latin text of the Carmina Burana. The Carmina Burana was basically a song about fortune, about fate. And one of the songs that we have translated was, "Let's away with study. Folly is sweet. Treasure all the pleasure of our youth. There's time enough for age to think on truth. So short a day and life so quickly hasting, and in your study wasting youth that would be gay and happy and cheerful." And so we find that the young students are there saying, we're sitting in the classroom and the professor is droning on and on and on with a PowerPoint lecture. It gets us next, though, to this great image that I mentioned, this trope of fortune, this fortune who is over all of the world, the empress of the world. And she is teaching people that you don't need to worry, you don't need to be anxious, but you also need to kind of hope as well, because nature is very ephemeral in this world. But you need to watch out as well for those perils of gluttony, drinking, gambling, and lusting. There are going to be bad times that follow you if you practice all of these vices. And soon the 7 deadly sins are going to become major symbols and emblems in literature and in art that we'll see next week. In fact, next, if you look, you can find that choirs, before they would sing their sacred song, their motets, they would gather around a wine keg. It'd be good to hear a Baptist choir with a little wine in them and see how wonderfully glorious they did sound. Next, one of the great songs that they point out was basically when we are in the tavern. And here is the kind of the great lyrics. When we are in the tavern, we don't worry about mortality, but we hasten to have a good time, at which we always work up a sweat. First, they toast the wealth of wine and drink of it very freely. Next, a toast to those in prison. After that, a toast to those still living. Fourth, a toast to all good Christians. Fifth, a toast to friends departed. Sixth, a toast to false and fickle nuns. Seventh, a toast to soldiers of the forest. Eighth, a toast to crooked friars, and a toast to monks disbanded. 10th, a toast to sailors at sea. 11th, a toast to troublemakers. 12th, a toast to penitents. 13th, a toast to those on journeys. And at the last, to king and pope, we all inordinately tope or drink. The mistress drinks, the master drinks, the soldier drinks, the cleric drinks, he drinks, she drinks. The servant drinks with the serving maid, the faithful drinks, the fickle drinks, the old ignorant lout, and the man of letters. The poor man drinks, the rich man too, the exiled and the unknown do. The boy child drinks, so does the dog. The dancer and the singer drink. The sister drinks, the brother drinks, the granny drinks, the mother drinks. She drinks, he drinks. 1,000 drink, 1,000 drink. And so we have the song with Kramer and Newman singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. It goes back to the 13th century we see there. And the next we see again that in the Middle Ages, everyone toped or drank a bit. It was kind of a regular pastime when your life is not going so well. Now, the next thing we see, however, are the universities began to become more powerful in the 13th century. The University of Bologna, the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, then later on in the next century, Oxford and other universities. And all of them, we find that philosophers and scholastics are going to begin disputing and arguing among themselves. And they saw this really as a sign of the devil, that the devil has come along. Next, we find that there are university professors who have to deal with a trickster whose name is Till Eulenspiegel. And he was a German character. In fact, he was challenged by the university professors to show how he could teach a donkey to read. And so he got the donkey in the stable, and he got a large book, and he put the book out, and he put pieces of hay between the pages. And so the donkey was able to turn the pages. And when the hay was not there, the donkey would go, ee-haw, ee-haw, ee-eh. And so he brought them to the professors, and he brought the book, and he put the book in front of them. And when he put the book in front of them, as we can see in the picture that is here, we find that the donkey is turning the pages looking for the hay. And Eulenspiegel said that, yes, I've taught him to say a couple of the vowels. He can say E and Ah. And as he turns the pages, he finds no hay. And so he goes, E-ah, E-ah, E-ah. And so Till Eulenspiegel, this great trickster, a good-natured rogue, kind of smirks and winks at all the establishment we see there. Now, Till became a doctor, a dentist, a blacksmith, a cobbler, a tailor, a tanner, a butcher, a horse dealer, a clown, a monk, a professor, and even a seller of relics. For example, one of his famous relics that he would sell to clerics, and clerics were very stupid, were what he would take his excrement and he would sell them as profit berries. And if you take these profit berries and eat them, you will be able to give the word of God to people. And so you have this wonderful kind of fool who comes in the Middle Ages and shows the high-minded, arrogant university professors what they are all about. Now, next we look to say how monks were kind of satirized this time too. And monks were likened to roosters. So what does that tell us? We see next that they were likened in three ways. Preachers were like roosters because both get up early at dawn, both ascend on a hill or a pulpit, both crow very loudly to get attention, both get the best grain, and both lay the hens. And so you can see this kind of corruption that some of the friars and preachers had. that the Middle Ages saw there. The next we find these jocular preachers who were always telling funny stories. In fact, one of the classic stories they told was an elderly woman was hearing a sermon on hell and brimstone and fire and the gnashing of teeth. And she mutters, she cries out, "Pastor, I ain't got no teeth." "Teeth," he said, "will be provided." And so jocular preachers were able to use humor to get people to listen to their sermons first by using wit. In fact, next we find that the great preaching strategy was ridendo dicere verum, to speak the truth laughingly. If you can put a little sugar in with the medicine, people will learn to listen, and they will listen to your more serious remarks when it is couched in laughter. But the friars give us a tradition of laughter, as we see next in the Old Friars Club. In fact, the father, the confessor of Stephen Colbert, James Martin, tells a famous Jesuit joke about poverty, in which a young novice is coming to the monastery and he's being introduced to his Jesuit community on the Feast of St. Ignatius. Now, the Feast of St. Ignatius is a very huge and sumptuous feast for the patron saint. It's the one day they really eat lavishly. And the novice sees the tables kind of laid out with filet mignons and numerous bottles of wine. And he shouts out, "If this is poverty, bring on chastity." What a great imagination for a young novice. Now, next we see that saints were very human. Even with all the legends that were built up about their sacrifices, their suffering, their miracles, we find that there is more comedy in them with St. Lawrence that we saw, who was burnt on the stake, and he said, "Turn me over." In fact, one little film that I would recommend is a film by Danny Boyle called Millions, in which Sister Clare and St. Francis and all of these saints kind of make cameo appearances. And much like many Roman Catholics of the 50s, they're smoking a lot. Those cigarettes are right there. And it's a very kind of comic but benign and kind view of saints and what is going on. However, next, there are certain mystics and ascetics like Hildegard of Bingen. Now, she is one of the most amazing women of the 13th century and from the whole Middle Ages. She was convinced as a mystic that laughter resulted from the fall of human beings. When men and women disobeyed God, everything became corrupt, as laughter did too. But as we talked about in the first lecture, laughter was a gift before the fall and was only corrupted and ruined by the fall. And so she thought, though, however, it was very carnal. She didn't trust the body. Nevertheless, she was described as a feather carried by the breath of God, ablaze with enthusiasm. And we ask, what is enthusiasm? And the root of enthusiasm is en, meaning in, theos, God. So to be enthusiastic is to be in God. And so here is her enthusiasm, and there is an hilarity with you when you are enthusiastic. And so to be enthused, like Hildegard of Bingen, is to be one who is filled with the joyous spirit of God. But the next thing we see about this 12th century mystic from the Rhineland, she was not only an abbess over all of her nuns, but she was also a prophet. She was a poet. She wrote some wonderful illuminated manuscripts. She was a botanist. She understood plants, and she knew how to pick the right plants and herbal medicines to kind of create out of them. She also wrote one of the earliest plays, a morality play, the first one by a woman. It was called the Ordo Virtutum, which is about the virtues. And the only part for a man in all of this play, usually acted out by all women, is the part of the devil. And all the man can do in this play is run. It's a perfect feminist text that is holy and also very moral at the same time. Now, the greatest mind next of this era was St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas argued that it's lawful for Christians to make use of fun, to relax the soul. He's very much influenced by Aristotle rather than Plato. And Aristotle had a sense of moderation, that you want to find what is temperate, what is right in the middle. And so he argues that not only is an excess of mirth and laughter a vice, but also is a lack of mirth. Because laughter can offer healing. It can bring you regeneration. It can change your soul. Now, he was called the dumb ox because as a young cleric, he was very quiet. He would be thinking. And yet he wrote one of the greatest texts of all, the Summa Theologica, that was there. And G.K. Chesterton, who was as large as Aquinas, both of them about 300 pounds. In fact, Aquinas, they said, they had to cut a crescent in the dining room table just so his belly could eat there. He was a great big man, but it was a man that really enjoyed to eat, enjoyed to think. And they called him a dumb ox because he was quiet. He was a mute ox. But when his teacher, Albert the Great, looked at him, he prophesied, one day this ox is going to bellow so loud that the world will hear. And he becomes the greatest mind of the Middle Ages. In fact, the next thing we see about him is that he contrasts buffoons and bores. Now, many people in the early church really would chastise buffoons because they would laugh too much and laugh at the wrong time. But he would say that the bores were just as bad because they can never make a joke up themselves, nor do they put up with people that do. So he said, we must live our lives between buffoonery and boorishness. There's a happy medium there. You engage in humor at the right time, the right place, and the right degree. He called this eutropelia, EU meaning good, and tropelia mean turning. So you turn something to good, you turn something to joy, you turn something to cheerfulness and wittiness. It was a wonderful thing. So Aquinas adapted all of these ideas from Aristotle, and he says we need to be recreated in this image, and we need to play. And there is the sin of playing too much, but there is the sin of playing too little. Now, next we find another saint that I just discovered about this week, more about what she had to say about laughter. And this is St. Julian of Norwich in the 15th century. And a time of plagues, persecutions, revolts, famine, and fear. She was an anchorite who lived in the church, and she laughed exuberantly. And Amy Loris Hall, I just read her book this week, and she really starts off with this quotation that we see next. She writes, I also saw our Lord scorn the devil's wickedness and set him at nothing. He wants us to do the same. But at this revelation, I laughed heartily, and that made those who were around me laugh too. And their laughter pleased me. I wish that all my fellow Christians had seen what I saw, and then they would all have laughed with me. But I did not see Christ laughing yet. Nevertheless, it pleases him that we should laugh, to cheer ourselves and rejoice in God, because the fiend has been conquered. Here is the woman who talked about all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And she saw it as a way in which the devil is going to be defeated. The devil is going to lose. In fact, there's a wonderful little book by C.S. Lewis called The Screwtape Letters. And there are going to be two churchmen that we're going to see in a couple of weeks who echo St. Julian's laughter at the devil. One of them was Martin Luther, who said, the best way to drive out the devil, if he is not going to yield to text of Scripture, is to jeer and flout him, to make fun of him, for he cannot bear scorn. And besides Martin Luther, there was the Roman Catholic Sir Thomas More, the man of all seasons. And he said the devil is such a proud spirit that he cannot endure to be mocked. And so St. Julian, with these great people that are going to follow her, recognizes this. And we see next an example of this, where God mocks from the heavens, where God looks down at the arrogant and supercilious, and he throws water balloons at them. And this is what Chesterton says, it is not so much that it rains, but God throws down rain on us to refresh us and to rebaptize us and to remind us that he in his heavens is going to have fun with us and will play with us whether we will or not. Now, next we come to another saint who everybody seems to neglect. And he was a favorite saint because his name was Saint Nemo. Now, Nemo means nobody. And so it is this play on words we find in the Middle Ages, where we say Saint Nemo is righteous, because scripture tells us that nobody is righteous. But Saint Nemo is righteous. But we find that Saint Nemo has also seen God and lived. We're told that nobody has seen God and lived, but Saint Nemo has. And the scriptures tell us that nobody can serve two masters, but Saint Nemo can serve two masters because he is Saint Nobody. Next, we come to the whole atmosphere. This next atmosphere is the one that the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin has described as a spirit of carnival, where the community gets together and celebrates the poor, the people that are marginal, the people that are neglected. And they also look at the lower strata of the body. We may emphasize with St. Thomas Aquinas of the mind and the life of the soul. But here we recognize that God also made the body, which is very grotesque, this lower part, and all the desires that God put there, especially in our digestion, our excretion, and in sex. And so these parts that God put into us are parts of our celebration of God. And so instead of just looking at thought and speech, we will look next at all of these parts about carnival. And during carnival, everything is going to be turned upside down. So what we see is the wise owl is going to become this wonderful kind of foolish creature. And we look next week at Rabelais, this great author of Gargantua and Pantagruel, his two giants, and who are excessive in everything they do. And we're going to see that everything is going to be turned upside down. And so those who are sad are going to be able to rejoice. And as the Lord said in his Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn now, for they shall soon laugh. And this is the time of carnival. Now, next we find that it happens in northern France around Christmas time, sometime in the 12 days of Christmas. And it's a time in when you also celebrate in what is called the Feast of Fools. And in the Feast of Fools, you celebrate Mary's Magnificat during the Annunciation, where she recognizes that the Lord has taken the humble and exalted them. And so the mighty are going to be pulled down from their seat, and the humble are going to be raised. And it's a wonderful celebration of carnival, where the small little people are able to take over for the great powerful people. Where we see that is next in carnival, which means farewell to the flesh. And this is generally what we know as Mardi Gras. This is Fat Tuesday, just before Lent. And you find that this is a wonderful time in which students are able to kind of mock their professors. In fact, many times we find that I've invited my students during different times to look at professors. And when they look at their professors, I say, I want you to go out and for your assignment, I want you to imitate your professor in the class. Find out what he or she says periodically. Find out different gestures of what they use and how they express themselves. Find the foolish things about your professor and come in and perform. And it's a wonderful, liberating experience for the students because they are able to make these high academic snobs into fools like themselves. It takes the high and mighty and brings us down. In fact, I'm 5'5", and one time a basketball player named Nick came into the room as me. And he used his hands a lot, but he was also on his knees. And he came shuffling in on his knees, and suddenly I was put in my place. And it's a kind of a wonderful image of how the Feast of Fools makes us all equal. Well, the next thing we find is that Harvey Cox wrote a book called Feast of Fools. Harvey Cox from Harvard University, kind of an old friend of mine, and he said what the clergy would do would be wearing masks, they would dress up as women or minstrels, they would sing the songs of Goliards, they would play dice at the altar. Remember, they're reenacting what the soldiers did at the cross and not just kind of gambling there, but there's something. Or they would choose a mock bishop who acted like a clown. And Harvey Cox brought this out in many different ways. But next we see that in this kind of Feast of the Fools, characters would ape the hierarchy. They would really make fun of them. They could hold their religious books upside down. They could wear orange peels as spectacles, or they would burn old shoes for incense with the pungent stench of feet. You can kind of begin to understand this. There were some great holy fools that kind of appeared at this time. One of them was St. Simeon. And St. Simeon once was going to the city of Emesa. And when he was going to Emesa, he passed by this garbage dump, this trash heap, and he found a dead dog. And he took a leash, and he took a rope, and he took the dead dog, he tied the dead dog to one end, and he tied the other to his waist. And he then would walk into the cathedral. And there in the cathedral at St. Petersburg, as he walked around this dead dog, he was giving us a parable of how the wealthy have all of this money. They have this dead dog that was wrapped around them, and they don't realize what they're carrying through. But he would also be the one who would eat a large quantity of beans before a church service. And during at certain times of the sermon, he would not only throw beans at the minister, but he would let out a loud applause and amen from his rear end. It was one way of telling a preacher that he's preaching too long. What we find next is that during Carnival, everyone comes together in the town square. Everyone becomes part of a community, and there is this free-for-all. People wear masks, they play topsy-turvy with ordinary life. And it's like Aquinas had said, that wine barrels ferment, and they're going to burst if we do not open them and let in a bit of air. So men and women at this time might burst if they're not allowed to be foolish. And this gets to next, the great piece of art by Peter Bruegel, the fight between Carnival and Lent. And this is a time that we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks of the Reformation. On one side, you have the inn, the bar, the tavern. On the other, you have the church and the monastery. And you find this battle between these two characters, this fat, gluttonous man who has sausages and a pig head on a pike, who rides the barrel of beer, against this woman who is ascetic, and all she has is these two slight fish for Friday's lunch. And it's this battle between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. The Protestants seen as the one who are now the carnival, the gluttons that are there. This gets us again back to this whole idea of grotesque eating. This next thing on grotesque eating is showing how during this time there is an ambivalence about life. Now, the ambivalence about life is that on one hand, you see the plague, you see decay, and you see death. But on the other hand, you are going to celebrate renewal and birth. And so the common image to kind of create this ambivalence was a pregnant old hag, this woman who is old and wrinkled like Sarah of the Bible, but she is rotund and fecund and ready to give birth to new life. And it's this wonderful kind of contrast and juxtaposition which is meant to kind of remind us that this life is not all there is. Now, Bakhtin, who wrote about this Rabelaisian world, began to kind of focus on bodily functions. And the body is funny if we allow it to be. In fact, if you look at this kind of little picture on the right, we find there are four men who are shoveling food in this gargantuan, this giant's mouth. And it's all meant to be kind of gross and robust and kind of rollicking outrageous that has been captured there. The next thing to look at is another 13th century book called The Roman of the Rose, The Romance of the Rose. And C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful book called The Allegory of Love, all about this. But in it, it deals with kind of female sexuality too. And the garden is an image of that which is protected, the virginity. And there's a gate there that the lover cannot get in until he woos and wins and marries the girl. And it is also the image of the rose as this kind of sexual organ. In fact, if you remember William Hearst's kind of parody when they did Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane and the great word is rosebud. And this was allegedly a symbol of Marion Davies, who was the mistress of Hearst, her sexual organ. And so you get going back to the Romance of the Rose going on here. But the prudish author, one of the prudish characters in the Romance of the Rose says, even if God did make the sexual organs, he didn't name them. And so we shouldn't talk about them either. But one thing that is so hearty and wonderful is that the Middle Ages gives us this freedom to look at our bodies, to recognize our bodies, and to see in one sense how grotesque they are, but how much they're also good and made by God. And this leads us to this next image where the body is good and grotesque. God made the body, but it still has all manner of all of these unseemly liquids. As St. Paul says, there are the unseemly members and all of these smells. There is blood, sweat, milk, snot, mucus, earwax, urine, semen, toe jam, saliva, and then all the stinky bits. These are the terms that middle school boys will use. They will laugh at these things because they're discovering their body. And the body is full of them. But in polite society, as Victorians and as Puritans, we probably don't mention them as much. But when they happen, when someone releases gas at a party, we begin to recognize this is the body that God has made. So next we see in modern comedy even. Next we see the kind of the body of excess, the body that it is comic, and everything from Monty Python, from his Holy Grail to the meaning of life. He looks and he finds in this grotesque but good body designed by God things that are funny. Next, we move to the final two sections, and that is what we would call the Terra Redemptum. It is this land of laughter, the earth of laughter. And the first begins in France, and the second will take us to merry old England. And each one contributes something that brings laughter to our world. The first one is there as we look at mystery, miracle, and morality plays. Here in Britain, we see that the clergy are suspicious of all of these new dramas that are popping up. In fact, Pope Innocent III issues a papal edict forbidding the clergy from acting on a public stage, as the clerics would have fun and they knew their Bible stories and they would go and enact these mystery plays. Or they would perform plays about saints, the miracle plays, or plays about every man or every woman called morality plays. And all of these mysteries were rooted in the Latin term mysterium, the act or the craft of performing. And where the Feast of Fools would be in France, these mystery, miracle, and morality plays we would find next in Britain. We would find them in merry old Britain, in the York mystery plays, the Wakefield mystery plays, the Chester Cathedral plays. In all of these places, we find the community is coming together to put on little dramas. Now, what we find next is that the plays of Corpus Christi, or the body of Christ, there are between 25 and 50 of them. They're there between the 14th and the 16th centuries. And the mystery plays will tell the story, such as the fall of Lucifer, and they will add, embellish other information. And as we see here, it is Michael, St. Michael the angel against Lucifer, and the two fight. Or we will get stories about Noah's flood, or about the shepherd's play, and then finally to the day of judgment, which is very fearful there. The next image we see is here at the Chester pageant, where there would be carts or wagons that would carry around, that were mobile, and you would put the different plays or stages on each of these carts. And so you would have these cycles, again, from creation to the day of judgment. And what they would do is they would perform them in the vernacular. Now remember, during this time in the Roman Catholic Mass, the sermons and the scriptures were still in Latin, and that was beyond the understanding of the people. And even the royal language in England is not in the vernacular English, it's in French. It's the language of the elite. And so here we have stories that are being told in the language of the people. The next we find even in 12th century Psalters or Book of Psalms, we find the images coming out, and these images telling the stories of Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden, And these images from the Psalter are going to then be kind of copied and imitated for the stage. In the next one, we find in both York and Chester, the Body of Christ mystery plays, the stories of Cain and Abel, this kind of violence of one brother against the other, and the fratricide, or the stories about saints and how they suffered and died. All of these stories are coming to the people, so it becomes kind of a common language and a common culture of all of these stories that are shared. In next, you find these wonderful kind of trade guilds that we're talking about, and each of them had a special story. They would host their story on their wagon. And you can see that we move from the creation on the left all the way to the maw of hell, this great open mouth of hell that is consuming people and eating them and digesting them. And it deals with the harrowing of hell by Christ. It is coming from that part of the creed where we say that Christ descended into hell. And when he descended into hell, he brought out captives from hell and he rescued them. And so it's this wonderful dramatic thing at the end of the judgment day where he's able to rescue people that we thought would be damned forever. And he rescues them and brings them into his presence. Now, this leads us next to a lot of the guilds and what they would do. The carpenters, for example, would be the ones that would build the cross. They would build anything that would be there. The bakers would give you the 5 loaves, the fishermen, the 2 fishes. The goldsmiths would give the nativity scene offerings of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of these would lead to the next one, where we find that a craft guild would perform their comic biblical stories as well, kind of amateur hour. And the Noah's Ark would be built by different people, and who knows, it'd be boat people that would come and check it, or farmers with their different kind of sheep, shepherds with all of their animals. But generally, in a story like Noah's Ark, you would show Noah, who was being nagged and bullied by his shrewish wife. So they would add a lot of comedy. Next, we find Noah and his wife became 2 of the most comic characters in all of the mystery plays. The puppet plays would come out, the plays on the stage, the guilders would be there. In fact, one of the kind of more modern stories of this is one that we talk about next, where we kind of adapt this story. Now, next we see that Noah and his wife were sitting on the deck of the ark, drinking their wine. She says, "I love you. I could never have gotten through these last 40 days and nights if it weren't for you." Noah laughs and he says, "Is that you or the wine talking?" "Hush," she answers, "I'm talking to the wine." Husbands are superfluous. That wine got her through those 40 days and nights. Next, we find one of my favorite images at the Chester Cathedral. B.J. Elfgren, who is kind of a local friend, she's a quiltist, and she's done some amazing quilts, done quilts on Narnia, done quilts on Chaucer's play, but this one is located, it's a huge quilt, kind of covering almost a whole wall, and it shows all of the things happening. If you look closely, you can see the shepherd's play on the left. Up on the top right, you can again see the kind of the maw, the mouth of hell, where the devil is holding his people there, but Christ is going to come. And they say that there are more postcards that come out of this kind of local native of Virginia, her quilt, than anything else that is sold there. Next, though, we move to kind of one little last thing on these stories, and that's the idea of the mummer. Now, the mummer basically comes from an old Middle East word, mum, which means silent, where we get mum as well. It's kind of a mask. And we find in these masks, they're associated also with this kind of idea of a disguised person. And it's where you come and you celebrate. You celebrate who you are. The next thing you see is that here we are, we're a mummer. And I'm a mummer, kind of a mix of both a Bugs Bunny rabbit and a Porky Pig. It's not working well, so let's go to the next image, I think, which is much better. Here we see the mummers who dress up in various ways with antlers. And you see that there is a kind of a combination where a monk can have the kind of the foot of a donkey as well, not only his tonsure on the top of the head. But here were the mummers coming out and singing and dancing, and again, taking the Feast of Fools from the French and bringing it all together. In fact, next we can even go to the city of Philadelphia, of brotherly love, and we find there that the mummers are out dancing. This is a different kind of protest, the protest for hilarity, the protest for celebration that, Lord willing, we will soon see back in our cities. In fact, the next image too shows how you can even get sponsors, and you would play off all of these images where people, whole communities would dress up. And so it may be secular, but it gets us back to the idea of the Feast of Fools and the plays. Next, we end up with the last play we'll look at. And this comes from the Towneley manuscripts. And in the Towneley manuscripts, we have a whole play called The Second Shepherd's Pageant. And it's a burlesque of the Nativity, the story of shepherds who basically have to bring a sheep, a little lamb, to the manger. And so we see it next in this kind of second shepherd's play, where they'll have stories about, they'll have emphases upon taxes, employers, upon husbands and wives. All of these things are going to be incorporated into the play. But here's the play itself that we see next. With a lot of tomfoolery, a lot of fooling around, Mock the thief steals a lamb from some shepherds who are going to take it to the manger. And he hides it in a cradle. It tends to bleat, bah, bah, bah. And the shepherds hear it and they go, what is that? Is that our sheep? And his wife says, no, that's my baby. And she says, I swear, if I have fooled the shepherds, I will eat this child that lies in the cradle if I'm fooling you. Now what Chesterton, looking at this play, has said basically, it's the test of a good religion, whether you can joke about it, whether you can play about God, whether you can play with God, whether you can take the stories and make them into comedy. And so we see there that this kind of reverse nativity is going on. But next we find it's not over yet, because one of the shepherds lifts up the child to kiss it. But he looks at the sheep and he says, what the devil is this? He has a long snout. And so they rescue their little lamb, and the woman does not get to eat it. And after rescuing the lamb, an angel commands them to go on to Bethlehem, where they greet a laughing child Jesus, and they give him cherries, a bird, and a ball, and of course, the little lamb. Now that leads us to our last image, which is the Virgin with laughing child. Antonio Rossellino, in the 5th century, the end of the 5th century, created one of the most memorable sculptures that we can see. Because in so many paintings and sculptures, we see a very somber and solemn Mary and her child. But here we get this true image of the Middle Ages, of the baby Jesus laughing, and laughing, even though he knows the cross is coming. He's laughing because there will be a resurrection. There will be a healing of his people. Well, that leads us next to the end, looking at next week, where we get to Chaucer and we get to the Renaissance of humor. And we close with Stephen Wright again, Deja Vu. He said, I went into a place to eat. It said, breakfast, anytime. So I ordered French toast during the Renaissance. Next week, we will have French toast during the Renaissance. We'll see you then. Thank you.